laws make some exceptions about criminal culpability for people who have severe mental illness because we mostly agree that a person who commits a crime while, say, experiencing psychosis was not truly in control of what their brains told them to do. But what makes us so sure we're in charge of our own decisions? From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. Every one of us, including those of us in excellent mental health, is the product of innumerable forces beyond our control, a swirling sea of hormones and neurons and genes and environmental and cultural and evolutionary forces going back millennia, all of which combine to influence who we are and how we act in every moment. Perhaps nobody truly decides anything. And if that's true, a lot of what we believe about good and evil, reward and punishment and willpower and motivation, it all starts to collapse like a house of cards. Robert Sapolsky is professor of biology and neurology at Stanford University and the recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant. His new book is called Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. Robert, welcome to Think.
Well, thanks for having me on.
So this book is filled with science, but you actually start with a fable about cosmic turtles. What is the short version of that story and what makes it useful here?
Oh, just this this joke we used to tell each other in college when we thought we were being clever. William James was giving a lecture about the nature of the universe. Afterward, this old woman comes up and says, "Professor James, you have it all wrong. The world is on the back of a turtle." And he says, "Oh, okay, but where does that turtle stand?" And she said, "On back of another turtle." And he said, "Ah, madam, but where does that turtle stand?" And her response was, "It's no use, Professor James. It's turtles all the way down."
Okay, and how does that relate to our brains and our free will?
Okay, so we do something and we ask, why did that happen? A person does something wonderful, they do something appalling. You say, why did they just do that? And the answer is that happened just now because of what came before. And what came before happened because of what came before that and turtles all the way down. And when it comes to our behavior, it's exactly the same. And sort of the secondary punchline to it is, my God, if that's ridiculous to just say it's turtles all the way down, it's much more ridiculous to say that somewhere there's a turtle just floating in the air, that we can behave with stuff that just comes out of nowhere, that we could be uncaused causes of the world around us, that we have free will.
So effectively, every thought we have, every decision we make, it is all influenced by something that happens that we do not control and may never actually be consciously aware of.
Well, even the ones that we're consciously aware of, but yes, and I even take it one step further, which puts me out sort of in the lunatic fringe of people arguing about free will, was I don't think it's just influences. I think when you see all the gears and stuff that goes into why did that person do what they just did, they're not just influences, they're determinative. There's no room for our everyday intuition that we think of as free will.
So wherever we land on this, Robert, after hearing you out, there is no question that it appears to all of us, and presumably even to you, that we have a significant amount of control over ourselves. Why is it so easy to perceive free will if, in fact, it's entirely an illusion?
Well, I would say one reason is the momentness with which we make a choice. And probably at the end of the day, the second reason is the more important one, which is it's a really depressing thing to contemplate there's no free will for a lot of people, even though I'll make the argument that that's actually a great thing. But back to the first one, you're choosing something. You got to choose which socks you're putting on today. You're got to choose whether or not to start a genocide. You make some sort of decision and you form an intent and you're consciously aware of it and you know what the outcome is likely to be if you do what you do. And most importantly, you've got an alternative. No one's got a gun to your head. There's other things. You don't have to do this. You are choosing. And for most people, that is like such a tangible moment right there that it just feels intuitively as if we're being free agents at that time. And what I go on and on about is that's great. That's great if you're consciously aware of your intent. And that's great if you knew you didn't have to do that and all of that. But that tells us nothing about free will because you're not asking the single question you got to at that point, which is so, how do you wind up being the sort of person who would form that intent in that location at that moment in time? And the reasons why is because of what came before and what came before that, and turtles all the way down, biological and environmental turtles.
All right, let's talk about where intent comes from. What might be happening preconsciously in our bodies before we feel as if we have come to a decision about something?
Well, it connects in with sort of your introduction, which was basically a much better summary of the book than I could ever come up with. So you do something. Why did that happen? Because something or other happened in the brain a second ago. And why did the brain do that at that point? Because of sensory stimuli a minute ago. And why was your brain particularly sensitive or insensitive to this or that type of stimulus? In part because of your hormone levels this morning at breakfast, and because of what the previous decade has been like: depression, stimulation, love, trauma, whatever, because all of those can dramatically change the brain. And then before you know it, what was going on in your adolescence and your childhood? And shockingly to some people, your fetal life, because your fetal environment was having a ton to do with constructing the kind of brain you were going to have as an adult. And then, as you noted, genes, and even something as bizarre as like what kind of culture your ancestors were inventing centuries ago, parentheses, what kind of ecosystems were shaping that, because that culture is what your mother raised you with within minutes of birth and was the guidelines for how your brain was constructed. And you put all those pieces together, and not only is it saying, ooh, all these different disciplines matter, you put all the pieces together and eventually it becomes one discipline, a single one. If you're, for example, talking about what genes have to do with behavior, by definition, you're talking about millions of years of evolution. But you're also, by definition, talking about your fetal life and what kind of programming of your genes was happening. And when you look at how all those pieces merge together, what you got to do is take someone who insists there's free will and say, oh, yeah, show me how it works. Show me how the thing that your brain just did was completely independent of all that history, was just floating in the air without any turtles below it.
What can we learn from lab studies about how easily our intentions can be manipulated seconds or minutes before we do something?
Well, there's a whole huge literature on that. I mean, the most straightforward, sort of wonderful one is straight out of the textbooks, which is you take somebody, you put them in a room, and you ask them to fill out a questionnaire, including like, what's your favorite laundry detergent? And this classic finding was if there's like a poster up on the wall there of the ocean and the ocean in the springtime or the ocean during a storm or what, people are more likely to write down that their favorite detergent is Tide. And then they will very consciously tell you why Tide is the best detergent in the universe and never have any idea that if that poster had not been up there, they're less likely to have made that choice. And this is a whole world of if you're hungry, you make different decisions. If you're tired, if you're scared, if you're stressed, if you're in a room that smells bad, if you're in a room that smells good, if unconsciously you've just walked down a block past a store that has this or that advertisement, it will change. And all that's going on the minutes before we make decisions. And they're predominantly ones that we're not even aware of. So there's that domain. What was just going on minutes ago?
I have to say, I've been thinking about this since years ago. I heard about a study that found that if you are going before a judge and the judge is deciding whether or not you get bond for some crime you've committed, you better hope that you're not the last person before lunch because everybody's hungry and cranky at that point.
Yes, I love that study. That is like by now it's totally irresistible. It was published in a very prestigious journal. There were some complaints from some cranks in the aftermath about statistical things they should have done differently, and the authors responded completely putting those complaints to rest and has since been replicated. So, okay, this is real science. And the finding is exactly what you said. The more hours it had been since a judge had eaten a meal, the less likely they were to give a favorable ruling to the person standing in front of them. What's that about? It's got to do with the fact that your brain's expensive. And the most demanding part of your brain that makes you think about the world from somebody else's perspective and makes you think, wait a second, did I just jump to a hasty conclusion? Let's think about it a second time and a fifth time, so on. That's the most expensive part of your brain. When you haven't eaten, your blood sugar levels get lower, your brain doesn't work as well, and this part of the brain particularly doesn't work as well. And late Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, who just died a few weeks ago, huge loss, his way of framing that was the much easier thing is to just go with what your first reflex is, which is this person is a criminal. Like send them, lock them up. It takes more work to try to figure out how their circumstances were different. It's just the easiest thing to fall back into the thing you normally do, which is to say, person's rotten, they did it. Not a chance are they walking free. And what's to me remarkable is like you get some judge and you say to them, wow, that's so interesting. You know, just after lunch this afternoon, you gave that person, you granted him parole. And just now, this person, 4 hours later, this other person who did the same crime, you just threw him back in the slammer for centuries. What's different there? And they'll go on about like freshman college philosophy or something. They're certainly not going to say because my blood glucose levels were like lower just now, and I had less ability to get my brain to see the world from somebody else's view. And this has been replicated. Do not go into a bank for a loan if the person you're going to be asking has gone for a long time since they've eaten. And if possible, find out if they got horrible sleep last night, if their stomach is gurgling, if their socks are too tight. And he said, because stuff like that is a significant factor in determining what's happening there. And that's, the hungry judges phenomenon is just playing out over the previous hours before saying, what's this judge going to do, making a life and death decision potentially.
When I was a mother of young children, I always had snacks in the glove box of my car to prevent meltdowns. Maybe we should always carry snacks with us and offer them to other people.
Yes, it's a perfect idea. Never ever like go before a judge without having some like Sour Patch or something to offer to the person.
Robert, I think lots of people might be with you when it comes to sort of making that easy knee jerk reaction based on our emotions in the moment. Years ago, I interviewed a guy who had been for years a skinhead, did terrible things to people that he later realized did not deserve any of it. He had a change of heart. He went through the difficult work of kind of re-educating himself and changed his life. I think his impression of this change, and will agree that it was a good change no matter what motivated it, was that he had some kind of conscious veto power over bad impulses. What do you think about that?
Well, first off, I think the world is a slightly more wonderful place each time I hear about someone like that. But he had a change of heart in dissecting that, not to take that metaphor too literally, but in dissecting how that happened. He may have framed it as I had a change of heart. I changed the way I view the world or whatever. I exercised free will. And when you look how really dramatic stuff goes into people changing, what you see is they did not choose to change. They were changed by circumstance. And by circumstance as a function of what sort of person they turned out to be at the moment they experienced that circumstance. Here's an equivalent one, since I don't know obviously anything about this guy's background. Very moving thing in the 1980s, Pearl Harbor Day. There's always a ceremony that day by survivors of the attack, old veterans there. And one year, from out of nowhere, this elderly Japanese man came up to them and apologized because he had been one of the lead fighter pilots on the attack. And he apologized for what he had done. And some of these guys told him to get lost, but a few others he became close with for the rest of their lives. And whoa, what went into this? How did this happen? And he was a POW towards the end of the war and wound up in an American POW camp instead of, like, who knows, a Russian one. And he was treated very well. He had a kid who years before had gone on an exchange program in college to the United States. The guy wound up being an executive in some multinational company. And he wound up liking Americans. And he didn't come from a culture that had hated Americans as the hated neighbors for 1,000 years. And the really interesting thing is, in the late 1930s, Japan invaded and occupied China and carried out the horrific rape of Nanjing and like incredible war crimes there. And he was a participant. And there was no evidence that he ever went to China to apologize. Wow. How did he wind up being changed in this domain, but not that one? Where are the bits and pieces of it? And you could begin to see how that explained how that guy wound up there and how he turned into this like moral giant in one domain without it having the slightest impact on another. That's the sort of person he turned out to be.
Our development in childhood and adolescence, aside from just the biological stuff alone, is affected by our parents and our peers and our environments and our culture, which is not the same as saying we will always do exactly what those elements want from us, right? Just that they play a role in who we are at the moment we take any sort of action or make any decision.
Yeah. And, implicit in you, like, even asking that is, it's ridiculous to talk about biology outside of the context of interacting with environment and they're equal contributors, all of that. But okay, you get somebody and they think their parents were so wonderful that all they want to do as an adult is be exactly like their parents. You would say, well, we're not seeing a whole lot of free will being shown here. Or you get somebody who is like horrified by everything their parents ever did. And they said, when I'm an adult, I'm going to wind up doing the opposite of everyone. They've not shown any more free will. Or if they wind up doing some things just like their parents and some things totally differently because of that really influential teacher they had back when, because of that peer pressure thing they succumbed to, where when you look at the pieces, we're the end product of course, parenting, but parenting embedded in like the rest of our environments. And they interact, and sometimes some are more powerful than others, but in all cases, it's what happened to you.
How does letting go of a belief in free will deflate the agency we assume belongs to people who possess what we call grit, this kind of special, resilient self-discipline that is used to keep going when things are tough?
Well, that's I think, the second most seductive realm in which people see free will. First one being, ooh, I just chose that ice cream. Ooh, I just chose to pull the trigger. I was exercising free will. How did you become that sort of person, et cetera? The second is when you look at those amazing exceptions, and they're so inspiring, and grit and backbone and tenacity and all of that, and people make this like crucial false dichotomy at that point, which is most people are willing to agree, yeah, there's stuff that we were handed by fate. We had no control over. You had no free will when it came to how tall you are or what your visual spatial coordination are. And yeah, there's stuff that we're handed, but what do you do with those things? That's where you show your backbone and the strength of your character and your moral compass. And it's this completely false view that there's the attributes you were given, which is made out of biology stuff. And then there's what you do with it, which is the measure of your like moral worth. And when you look at the science of how we make decisions and how we make bad ones and how we succumb to some things and how we resist other temptations, it's made of the exact same biology as the stuff that we have no trouble seeing that we had no control over. And it's got to do with the neurobiology that's well understood. When the going gets tough, or you got to like give up on it, or you got to get going, and you got to show tenacity and gumption and all that. And that's made of biology. That's made mostly about how this one part of the brain called the frontal cortex turned out to be the kind it is in your brain. And it's made of the same stuff, but it's so hard to see that because we all have this intuitive sense that like somewhere inside our heads, in our brain, but not made of brain stuff, there's a me. There's a me that's somehow separate of all of that, and there isn't.
So if free will existed, it would require a kind of supernatural ability to transcend biology?
Biology and its interactions with environment, blah, blah, blah. Yes, absolutely. And like at some point, if you're saying there's no free will and people are challenging you and they say, well, prove it, for one thing, you want to scream because you can't prove the absence of something. But more importantly, by now, we know enough about how genes and environment and culture and hormones and all of that make somebody who they are, that at this point, the onus of proof should be turned on somebody who's claiming that we can act as free agents to say, oh, yeah, show me how that works. Show me how a brain will have done something completely independent of what happened a second ago and an hour ago and 100 years ago. Show me how that works, and you'll have just proved that there's free will. And you can't show that because nothing that we do is ever outside of the context of the sort of person we turned out to be. And that's always an end product of the biology over which we had no control and its interactions with the environment that we had no control over.
What is chaos theory, and how has it been used by some thinkers in service to the belief that we must have free will?
Oh, this is like this whole domain of like Hail Marys that people pull out and believe in free will, where they say, okay, yeah, neurons, okay, genes, okay, all that stuff. But here's where you really get free will from. And there's three domains where that's inevitable. One is the first one you mentioned, which is chaoticism, chaos theory, which is like the coolest revolution in science and overturned centuries of reductive thinking, and it's the best. And I torture my students by going on days and days in class teaching about it. And it's then viewed as it's a way of formal proof that some things are unpredictable in the future. Like it doesn't matter how amazing of a magnifying glass you have and how close you could finally see what's really going on. There are some things that are and will always be unpredictable. And people then make this mistake of thinking unpredictable means undetermined. And you get a whole sort of, way out there in left field branch of philosophers who argue we have free will because of chaoticism. The second domain is emergent complexity, which is just as wonderful and just as unrelated to free will. And the third one, God help us all, is the argument that quantum indeterminacy is the basis of free will. And that's one where, like, rationality typically goes out the window in a really dramatic way when saying somehow the fact that it does indeed appear to be the case, that aspects of the universe at the subatomic level, things happen there for no reason, that somehow we are able to harness that, the me inside there, and pull our like moral structure out of that and turn that into our guidepost for how we choose things in life. And there's a whole bunch of technical levels on which quantum indeterminacy could not be what's causing you to be who you are. So all three of those are amazing, cool scientific revolutions, and they're the best in all of that, but they're not where you find free will from. That's not the way out.
All right, so let's just set quantum physics aside for a moment, Robert, and assume, for the sake of this discussion, we are with you on this question of free will, that we will accept for the moment it does not exist. It's an interesting thing to ponder scientifically, but I mean, it has enormous ramifications for real life if we decide to accept it. Like, if nobody is truly acting on free will, what happens to our long-standing policies and beliefs around things like criminal culpability?
None of it makes any sense whatsoever. Because if you truly, truly believe there's no free will, and like I recognize that's a hard sell, and I would be perfectly content for people to just be convinced there's a whole lot less free will than what we think. But if you really take it to its logical conclusion, blame and punishment never make any sense. Praise and reward never make any sense, because never make any sense as virtues in and of themselves. They could be good instrumental tools, both punishment and reward, but they are not virtuous because you're doing it to somebody who did not have any control over what they did, whether it was the horrible crime they committed or how they turned out to be the CEO of their company. If you really follow this stuff through to its logical conclusion, none of us have earned anything. None of us are more deserving of having our needs considered any more than any other person's. And if this also is how stuff works, hating somebody is like as ridiculous as hating a hurricane. And you put all those pieces together, and oh, yeah, that's like an incredibly radically different way that we have to look at the world. And it's at this point that people throw up their hands and say that's impossible. And what I take tremendous comfort from is that for centuries, over and over and over, we've been learning how things work in the world, and we reach the same conclusion. Oh, people didn't actually have control over this. And each time we do that, not only doesn't the world fall apart, it becomes a more humane place. I mean, think about it. If it was 400 years ago and we all believed in free will, among other things, we would consider that free will involved the ability to choose to spend your night under the full moon with like frogs in your big kettle and doing potions and stuff. And as a result, you cause the tornado the next day. Oh, you know what? Witches can't control the weather. And in fact, there really aren't. There's no free will when humans can't do that. So let's incorporate that domain where we just subtracted out free will and not burn old ladies at the stake. It's a better world. It just became much more humane. It became more humane when we figured out 50 years ago that like some kids are just not learning how to read, not because they're stupid and unmotivated, but because there's an architectural glitch in one part of the cortex in their brain. And as a result, they have something called dyslexia, and they reverse closed loop letter. And with each one of those steps, when we have just moved from you're a witch who controlled the weather, when we moved from you're unmotivated and lazy and can't pay attention, and I'm going to have you raised so that as an adult, you're going to feel your whole life that that's who you were, at each one of these junctures, when it turns out, oh, it doesn't work that way, it's become a better world. Because over and over and over, we think we can live in a world, and it's okay, where some people are treated way worse than average for things they had no control over, and some people are treated way better than average likewise. And it's like a much nicer world when you figure out that's not how it works.
If hating someone is illogical, does that make loving someone also illogical, if still good?
Oh, you turned out to be one of the lucky humans. I'm one of the lucky ones. I love my wife. She loves me. We found each other. How did that happen? And part of it because of, I don't know, the pheromones we give off. Part because of what my vasopressin levels were in my brain the day we bumped into each other. Yeah, that doesn't come from nowhere either. And you have exactly sort of the challenge you just alluded to, which is, does that take all the air out of love? Does it deflate it when it turns out that there's like gears underneath the surface that we weren't aware of before? Absolutely not. I mean, we're biological machines and we know where the buttons and levers are. And does that take away like the pleasure of eating something when you're really hungry? We're machines that nonetheless can feel good, can feel sad, can feel pain. And even if this makes no sense at all to think that it's better that good things than bad things happen to a machine, it's a good thing when good things happen instead of bad things happen to us.
Robert, of course, we know people commit crimes that do harm others. We have a societal interest in protecting people from those acts. How can we operate if we don't believe people are ultimately responsible for having done bad things? What do we do with them after those things occur?
Oh, it's easy. Easy, I say, is 1,000 years worth of criminologists turn over in their graves. Um, it's easy because we've done this in the past where we look at somebody who turned out to be the sort of person who's potentially damaging, dangerous, whatever. Do we say, there's no free will, just let them run amok on the streets there? In fact, let's all of us just run amok. Why not? We can't be held responsible. No, obviously not. If you're saying there's no free will, you're not saying, let the murderers like stand behind you in line in Starbucks or something. But what you have instead is a radically different model. And it's one that comes from public health, which is, yeah, you got to protect people from dangerous individuals. And what you do is you quarantine them. Okay, what do I mean by that? You figure out the absolute minimum needed so that the thing that makes them dangerous, they're no longer dangerous about. And you don't constrain them 1 inch more than that. And you don't tell them they have a rotten soul in the process. And you even try to figure out how things can go wrong and some people turn out that way. Okay, this sounds like absurd, but like you got a car and its brakes don't work and you don't know how to fix it, and it's dangerous. You don't let it out on the street. It'll damage people and you quarantine it. You put it in the garage, but you don't go in every day with a sledgehammer and hit it over its hood. And you try to figure out, oh, why do brakes break sometime? And you're sitting there saying, oh my God, this guy, he's like so me. He's like so mechanistic. It is so dehumanizing into turning us into machines like that. That's a hell of a lot better than sermonizing us into being sinners when we're biological machines. Okay, here's an example where we do this. Ooh, we run our world based on a quarantine model to protect people from dangerous stuff, and we could do it without invoking free will. You got an airline pilot and they get hay fever in the spring and they're sneezing like crazy and they have to take some antihistamines, and antihistamines make you drowsy. And thus, I don't know the exact rule, but all sorts of airlines have rules that if you're taking antihistamines, you can't fly. You can't be a pilot for a few days. Not because you've been consorting with Satan and Beelzebub has made your nose run or some such thing, and thus you've had to take this drowsiness inducing. No, you're not a bad person. We've like figured that out about 4 centuries ago, that illness and moral worth do not go hand in hand. You're not a bad person, but like don't fly a plane when you're drowsy. So do that. 300 years ago, illness and moral worth were absolutely intertwined. We're so far past subtracting free will out of our picture of illness like that we don't even realize, oh, that's a domain in which we stop believing in free will. And ooh, in the face of something potentially dangerous, pilots falling asleep while they're piloting your plane, we came up with a quarantine rule that doesn't demonize them and protects society. And not only is it okay, but it's like a better world that drowsy pilots aren't flying, or like a sneezing pilot who's sitting at home that day. We're telling that person that they've been in bed with like the Dark Lord or Lord Voldemort or something. We don't think that way anymore. And it's so straightforward that we can't even recognize it as, oh, that's something a few centuries ago, people subtracted free will out of that equation and figured out, nah, we got to do something different.
If free will is an illusion, does that mean society's ideas about good and evil are also determined by forces much larger than the individuals and systems within them?
Yeah. And of course, those larger forces working on individuals who respond to those forces as a function of what sort of person they turned out to be when those forces, but yeah, good and evil make no sense. Forgiveness, which is an absolutely wonderful virtue, and we need vastly more of it. But when you really dissect all of that, forgiveness is like you shouldn't like feel obliged to figure out, learn some botany, and then forgive the plant that's causing you your hay fever. It's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with it.
My husband and I watched a movie recently where the main character is very manipulative and devious and ultimately kills some people and in the end walks away scot-free. My husband didn't like the movie because the anti-hero didn't get punished. I mean, this is entirely fiction. He understood it was fiction. Why does it feel so good to punish what we perceive to be bad behavior?
Yeah, well, if you frame that evolutionarily and start thinking about like game theory type stuff, because it's costly to punish. Like if one baboon is watching another baboon being awful to some kid, and this baboon has to be all heroic and go in and intervene, he may get his rear end slashed. There may be a cost to him being a like moral force there in his baboon trooper. Punishing is costly. In the pure evolutionary sense. And how are you going to evolve then a system where, like, you see all these formal models showing without punishment, you never evolve cooperation in populations of organisms and stuff? Like, how are you got to come up with some solution. Oh, in our species, the solution is we secrete this neurotransmitter called dopamine when we're getting to righteously punish somebody. It feels good. That's like a big piece of it. And that's something that has to go into the equation every time you got to do any sort of like criminal justice reform. 500 years ago, it felt good to watch some criminal being drawn and quartered in the town square, and you all get to hear him screaming. And like 100 years ago, it felt good to watch somebody being hung in public. And like in each one of these steps, people have had to get their sense of pleasure and like justice has been done from a different source. But yeah, one of the great like dirty motivators we have as biological organisms is punishing people feels good.
Robert, do you think if we all accept that there is no free will, we will all lose motivation and just, get on a pool float and let whatever will happen happen?
Um, no, we may do that at the beginning, and we might even like pocket some stuff, shoplift some things, or be mean, or we may, what all sorts of science suggests in some really like interesting, decent studies, is when you first find ways of manipulating people into believing less in free will. Yeah, they tend to cheat more on the economic game that they play immediately afterward. They tend to become less generous in those games. They potentially become less motivated, all of those things. But when you look at people who have long thought that there is no free will, they're exactly as ethical as people who believe very strongly in it. But you bring up what still, for me, is like this huge problem. Yeah, criminal justice. What do we do with dangerous people? We got to keep them off the street. Meritocracy. It's just as dangerous if we have like the person like you got a brain tumor and let's pick somebody at random because we don't believe in elitist principles anymore. Let's pick somebody random off the street to take your brain tumor out tomorrow. That's dangerous also. So you got to protect society in the form of having competent people who do jobs that require a great deal of competence. And what's almost always the problem with that is it takes a lot of work. You got to study for years and years and years. That's years and years of like your damn roommate going out and partying while you say, no, actually, I have work to do. And like, how do you do that other than motivating people with some version of, we're going to tell you you are a human with tremendous moral worth and societal worth and deserve the wealth that you get and deserve the sense of entitlement and all that. How are you going to motivate people for that? That's the one that I can't begin to figure out how you do it. I'm completely stymied with that. There's always going to be like the complete crazies out there who would like pay you for the chance to spend 20 years studying geckos or whatever it is they obsess over. And like, that's great. That let them be that sort of like specialist saving the planet for geckos and being that motivated all on their own. But yeah, praise, reward, those are very, very motivating. And I think somewhere in there, we need to use them as good instrumental tools, just as it's okay to punish some individuals, not because they've got a rotten soul or it's virtuous, parentheses, and feels fun to get to punish somebody, because that's one of the effective tools that could be used in some circumstances. And reward is the same thing in others, but just be really prudent in how it's applied and make sure that somehow people can become very competent at difficult things without feeling that that means they should be able to stand in the front of the line when, good things are being handed out because they didn't earn it. They turned out to be that sort of person.
Yeah, I think for me it's so interesting. I mean, the Jeffrey Dahmer problem, saying that lots of factors cause this person to do horrific things, it is less vexing than the Mother Teresa problem, which says that she
Yeah.
doesn't. There's nothing. She was going to be Mother Teresa regardless.
Who's listening to this? You and I are sitting here and we're talking about like free will and philosophy, and who's going to be interested in listening to this, and how we wind up being the sort of people who would be talking about and like what we're seeing are versions of like we turned out to be the lucky ones. We can listen to an NPR program like this because we're not out collecting firewood. The people who are most likely to be sitting here being told, here's the signs of why there's no free will, are the people who are most likely to feel vastly bummed out by this because it means you didn't earn your prestigious degree or your great job or the world viewing you as a kind, loving person, and you didn't earn any of this stuff. And that's a total bummer. And thus we have like this thing that by definition, if it's depressing for you to contemplate there being no free will, by definition, you're one of the lucky ones because of the way the world works, you turned out to be one of the ones who's treated way better than average for things you had no control over. For people out there where it turned out the luck they were handed was not very good, it's not depressing to find out you're not responsible for it. It's liberating.
Okay, what do you do with the irony or the futility of knowing you've written a book to convince people that free will isn't real?
Well, the irony, I can absolutely see how I turned out to be the sort of person I am, for better or worse. I can see how my parents traumatized me in the exact perfect way, not too hot or too cold, and got it just right. It takes a lot of air out of one's sense of how what kind of person you are, and what sort of things you wound up doing. Why did I wind up like writing this like book that 4.5 people are going to read instead of winding up being a serial murderer? And do I deserve anything as a result that I happen to turn out to be this sort of person instead of that? No, but that's really hard. And what I think is most important about that is, I've been thinking this way since I was 14. I stopped believing in free will when I was 14. And I've now spent decades and decades learning the science and all of that. And I absolutely, totally believe that blame and punishment and entitlement make no sense at all intellectually and ethically. And I can actually function as if I don't believe in free will, like 3 minutes every other month or so. Because, yeah, it's really hard. But at least I don't believe that there's witches anymore.
Robert Sapolsky is professor of biology and neurology at Stanford University and a recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant. His new book is called Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. Robert, thank you for talking us through this.
Well, thanks for having me on. This was a pleasure.
Again, I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.